When I transferred to Ridgeview University my sophomore year, I was desperate for a fresh start. My first year at another college had been rocky, academically and socially, so when I was offered a single dorm room at Ridgeview, I jumped at the chance. But a week before classes started, the housing office emailed me. There had been a mistake. They were overbooked and I would have a roommate after all. Her name was Elena Gray. The email didn't say much else, just that she'd be arriving 2 days after me. I remember shrugging it off, figuring that I could adjust. I told myself it might even be good to have someone around this time, a chance to make a real connection. The day Elena arrived, I was in the middle of unpacking a box of books. She entered the room so quietly that I didn't even hear her until she cleared her throat. I turned to see a small, pale girl standing just inside the door. Her dark brown hair was tied back neatly, and she carried 2 large duffel bags, one slung over each shoulder. She didn't look at me directly. Her eyes were focused somewhere past me. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I introduced myself, and she gave a slight nod in response. She didn't offer to shake my hand or ask any of the usual questions people ask when they're meeting their roommate for the first time. Instead, she walked over to the empty side of the room and began unpacking her things in silence. Her belongings were sparse. She had a few changes of clothes, a small toiletry kit, and a couple of old paperback books. No decorations, no photos, no posters. The only personal item she placed on her desk was a plain black journal. I tried making conversation, asked where she was from, what her major was, but her answers were short and vague. She was from a small town she didn't name, studying psychology, and didn't seem interested in saying more. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, I gave up and went back to organizing my things. For the first few days, we lived alongside each other without much interaction. Elena was quiet, almost unnervingly so. She didn't seem to go to the dining hall, and I never saw her eat in the room. She spent long hours sitting at her desk, writing in that black journal. When she wasn't writing, she was lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She never played music, watched videos, or talked on the phone. The silence in our room felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. One night, about a week into the semester, I woke up to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was a mouse or maybe tree branches scraping against the window. But as I sat up in bed, I realized the sound was coming from Elena's side of the room. She was sitting at her desk, scribbling furiously in her journal. The only light came from her desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Her movements were frantic, almost manic, as if she was trying to get the words out faster than her hand could move. I asked if she was okay, but she didn't respond. Her pen didn't pause for even a second. After a few moments, I gave up and lay back down, pulling the blanket over my head to block out the sound. The next morning, I found her journal sitting open on her desk. I knew it was wrong to look, but curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I'd just glance at the page to see what she was writing so furiously about. The page was filled with tiny, cramped handwriting, almost illegible. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. It was just a series of fragmented sentences, half-formed thoughts, and random phrases. But as I read further, a chill ran down my spine. Among the jumbled words were phrases like, "She's watching me," and "I can't trust her." I stepped back quickly, my heart racing. Did she mean me? When Elena returned to the room that afternoon, I couldn't help but look at her differently. She must have noticed because she tilted her head slightly, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Something wrong?" she asked, her voice as soft as ever. I shook my head quickly, forcing a smile. "No, nothing. Just tired." She didn't say anything else, but for the rest of the day, I felt her eyes on me, as if she was waiting for me to slip up. The strange incidents continued to pile up. I started waking up more often in the middle of the night to find Elena sitting at her desk, writing in that journal. Other times, I'd wake to hear her whispering to herself, though I could never make out the words. Once, I came back to the room after class and found her standing in front of my desk, holding one of my notebooks. She wasn't reading it, just holding it in her hands and staring at the cover. When she noticed me, She put it down quickly and muttered an apology before retreating to her side of the room. I tried to convince myself that she was just eccentric, that maybe she had anxiety or some other issue that made her act this way. But as the semester went on, her behavior grew harder to ignore. She started leaving strange notes for me. The first one was tucked under my pillow. It said, "I know what you're doing." The second was taped to the inside of our mini fridge. "Stop lying to me." I tried confronting her about the notes, but she just stared at me blankly and said she didn't know what I was talking about. One weekend, I decided to go home and get some space. My parents only lived about an hour away, and I figured a couple of days away from the room would help me clear my head. When I returned on Sunday evening, I noticed immediately that something was off. My desk drawers had been opened and rummaged through. My clothes were in disarray. Even my bedding felt wrong, as if someone had been lying on it while I was gone. I confronted Elena again, my voice shaking with anger. She didn't deny it this time. "I needed to check," she said simply. "Check for what?" I demanded. She didn't answer, just turned back to her journal and started writing again, as if our conversation was already over. The breaking point came a few weeks later. By then, I was spending as little time in the room as possible, studying late at the library or crashing on a friend's couch. One night, I returned to the room after midnight to find Elena gone. Her bed was neatly made, her desk lamp off, and the journal that usually sat on her desk was missing. Relieved to have the room to myself, I got ready for bed quickly. But as I pulled back the covers, I froze. Tucked under my blanket was a single sheet of paper. It was a page torn from Elena's journal. On it, in her cramped handwriting, were the words, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to hurt you." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the note. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The room, already dim, felt suffocating now, the shadows stretching out like claws toward me. What did she mean? Hurt me how? I tried to convince myself it was just another one of her bizarre attempts to get inside my head. But the word hurt clung to me like a weight I couldn't shake off. I debated leaving the room, finding somewhere, anywhere, else to sleep that night. But exhaustion and fear kept me rooted. I told myself I was overreacting. Elena wasn't dangerous. She was just weird. Maybe this was her strange sense of humor or some kind of test to see how I'd react. So I stuffed the note into my backpack, climbed into bed, and pulled the blanket tight around me. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the trees outside, made me jolt upright, my ears straining for any sign that Elena had returned. She didn't come back that night. The next morning, I woke to find the room exactly as it had been when I'd gone to bed. Her bed still made, her desk still empty. No sign of her journal. I was halfway through brushing my teeth when I realized how quiet it was. Elena usually didn't leave the room for long stretches, certainly not overnight. I debated calling someone, our RA campus security, but I hesitated. What would I say? That my roommate left me a creepy note and now wasn't answering her phone? I ended up going to class as usual, but I couldn't focus. Every time I glanced at the empty desk beside me, I felt a gnawing unease. By lunchtime, I decided to check with the housing office. The woman at the front desk seemed confused when I asked if Elena had mentioned moving out or transferring. "She hasn't submitted any paperwork," she said, scanning her computer screen. "And we don't have any reports of her withdrawing." I thanked her and left, more unsettled than ever. Days passed, and Elena didn't return. At first, I felt relieved. The tension in the room was gone, and I finally had space to breathe. But as time went on, her absence started to feel less like a reprieve and more like a weight pressing down on me. Her belongings remained untouched. Her neatly folded clothes, her spare shoes, even her toothbrush in the caddy beside mine. It was as if she just stepped out for a moment and never came back. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to search her side of the room. I started with her desk drawers, feeling a pang of guilt as I rifled through her things. Most of it was unremarkable, loose papers, pens, a couple of spiral notebooks. But tucked in the back of the bottom drawer, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a Polaroid photo. In the photo, I was sitting at my desk, headphones on, typing on my laptop. I had no memory of Elena ever taking the picture. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I stared at the photo. My first thought was to leave, grab my things and never come back to this room. But where would I go? I couldn't just abandon my dorm. Instead, I shoved the photo into the back of the drawer and slammed it shut, trying to convince myself it wasn't as sinister as it seemed. Maybe she'd taken it as some kind of experiment for her psychology classes. Or maybe it was part of a project. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the room. I ended up crashing on a friend's floor, claiming I had a bad headache and didn't want to be alone. The next morning, I returned to find the dorm room still empty, Elena's things untouched. But something had changed. On my desk, where my laptop usually sat, was another note. This one read, "You shouldn't have looked." Panic set in. How had the note gotten there? I'd locked the door when I left. I grabbed my bag and practically ran to the housing office, demanding to speak to someone about getting a new room. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I just wanted out. The woman at the front desk looked at me sympathetically but said there weren't any open rooms. "We can put you on a waiting list," she offered, but that wasn't good enough. I asked if they'd seen Elena, if she'd checked in or moved out officially, but the answer was the same as before. Nothing. Desperate, I asked to speak to campus security. Maybe they could help track her down. The officer I spoke with seemed skeptical at first, but when I told him about the notes and the photo, his demeanor changed. He promised to look into it and said they'd let me know if they found anything. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety. I barely ate, barely slept, and avoided my room as much as possible. On Monday morning, I got a call from campus security. "We found her," the officer said. Relief flooded me, until he continued. "She's in the hospital. A family member called us after she had some kind of episode at home. She's been there for a while now." I felt a wave of confusion. "What do you mean, a while?" The officer hesitated. "Apparently, she left campus over 2 weeks ago." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. That didn't make sense. I'd seen her in the room just days ago. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "That's not possible. She was here last week." The officer's tone grew cautious. "Are you sure about that?" I hung up without answering. When I returned to my room that afternoon, Elena's side was completely empty. Her clothes, her shoes, even her toothbrush. They were all gone. The desk was wiped clean. No sign of her journal or any of her belongings. It was as if she'd never been there at all. For the rest of the semester, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I often woke up to the sound of faint scratching, even though there was nothing there. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing outside my window, but when I turned on the light, the space was empty. I never found out what happened to Elena or why she left her belongings behind. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that black journal and the words scrawled across its pages. "I didn't want to hurt you." When I moved into my shared apartment for junior year, I was just relieved to escape the cramped dorm life. My new roommate, Megan, seemed like the ideal match. Quiet, studious, and respectful of space. She had already been living in the apartment for a year, so she had dibs on the larger bedroom, which was fine by me. I preferred the cozy second bedroom anyway. It felt tucked away and private. Megan wasn't exactly warm, but she wasn't unfriendly either. She'd ask how my classes were going and occasionally invite me to join her for dinner. But most of the time, she kept to herself. It was about a month into the semester when I noticed the drawer. Megan had this tall, antique dresser in the living room, one of the few pieces of furniture she had brought with her. Its dark wood surface was polished to a gleam, and its brass handles looked almost ornate. One of the drawers, the third one from the top, was locked. I wouldn't have thought much of it. People have private things after all, but one night when Megan was out, I heard it. A faint tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a branch hitting the window. But when I went to investigate, I realized the sound was coming from the dresser, specifically from the locked drawer. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. The tapping stopped, and the apartment fell silent again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old dresser settling, or my mind playing tricks on me. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other strange things about the drawer. Sometimes, when Megan wasn't home, I'd hear faint whispers. Not loud enough to make out words, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I also noticed that Megan seemed to avoid the dresser. She never opened the other drawers while I was around, and she always seemed to keep her distance from it, as if it made her uneasy. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to ask about it. We were sitting in the living room, both of us buried in our laptops, when I casually said, "That's a beautiful dresser. Is it an antique?" Megan froze for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she shrugged. "It was my grandmother's. She gave it to me when I moved out." "What's in the locked drawer?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She didn't look up. "Just some old papers." Her answer was too quick, too dismissive. I could tell she didn't want to talk about it, so I dropped the subject. A few nights later, I woke up to a loud bang. I shot out of bed, my heart pounding. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I crept into the living room, my hands trembling. The dresser drawer was open. Not just open, pulled all the way out, resting on the floor. Papers were scattered around it, some yellowed with age, others looking like they'd been burned along the edges. I knelt down and hesitated. My instincts told me not to touch anything, but my curiosity got the better of me. The papers weren't just random documents, they were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to someone named Lila. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, the ink smudged in places as if from tears. One of the letters caught my eye. It read, "I can't take it anymore. You never listen. You don't understand what you've done to me. I wish I could lock you away forever." I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. I heard a sound behind me and spun around. Megan was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low and trembling. I stammered an apology, trying to explain that I'd heard a noise and thought someone had broken in. She didn't say anything, just walked over, picked up the drawer, and slid it back into place. Then she turned to me, her eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. "Don't touch it again," she said. After that night, things between us were different. Megan barely spoke to me, and when she did, her tone was clipped and distant. The tapping continued, though, always when she wasn't home. One afternoon, I came back from class to find a locksmith leaving our apartment. Megan was standing by the dresser, her arms crossed. "New lock," she said curtly, as if that was all the explanation I needed. I nodded and went to my room, my chest tight with unease. The last time I heard the tapping was the night before Megan moved out. She told me she was transferring to another university and had found someone to sublet her room. Part of me was relieved. I wouldn't have to deal with the tension anymore. That night, I was lying in bed when I heard the sound again, louder than ever. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a knock. I lay frozen, my eyes locked on the crack under my door, half expecting to see shadows moving across the light. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, the dresser was gone. Megan left early the next morning. She didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a forwarding address. A week later, her subletter moved in. The apartment felt normal again, free of the oppressive tension that had hung over it. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that locked drawer and the letters inside, and I wonder what or who she was really trying to lock away. I met Clara on the first day of college. She was standing by the door of our shared dorm room, already unpacked, her side of the room immaculately organized. She looked up from her phone and gave me a quick smile, a polite but distant acknowledgement. Clara was tall and thin, with a stiff posture that made her seem older than the rest of us. Her dark hair was cut into a neat bob, and her glasses perched perfectly on her nose, as if they'd never once slid out of place. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice as precise as her appearance. I introduced myself, and we exchanged a few pleasantries. She asked about my major, my hometown, and my hobbies in a way that felt more like she was collecting data than making small talk. Within minutes, I realized two things. Clara was impossibly structured, and she didn't seem interested in being friends. Her half of the room was a reflection of her personality. Everything labeled, color-coded, and placed at perfect right angles. She pinned her class schedule to the corkboard above her desk, alongside a meticulously handwritten daily planner. Clara's obsession with her schedule quickly became apparent. She woke up at exactly 6:30 a.m. every day, even on weekends, and spent precisely 15 minutes in the shower. Breakfast was always a protein bar and black coffee, consumed while reviewing her notes for class. By 9 p.m., she was in bed, lights out, no exceptions. At first, I found her routines amusing. I teased her lightly about her rigid habits, but she never reacted, just nodded and continued whatever she was doing. It wasn't until the third week of classes that I noticed something strange. Her schedule wasn't just strict, it was unchanging. I mean that literally. Every single day, she followed the exact same routine down to the minute. She didn't deviate even when we had a long weekend or our classes got canceled. And then there was the studying. Clara spent 3 hours every evening at her desk, her notes spread out in front of her. But what struck me was how mechanical it all seemed. She wasn't actively reading or writing. She was just staring. I'd glance over sometimes, trying to figure out what she was looking at, but her eyes never moved. She didn't take notes or highlight anything. She just sat there, perfectly still, her eyes fixed on a single page. One night, curiosity got the better of me. "Clara," I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, "what are you studying?" "History," she said without looking up. I glanced at the book open in front of her. It was an introductory history textbook, the same one we'd been assigned for our shared class. "But we don't have any assignments due," I said. "I'm reviewing," she replied. Her tone was flat, devoid of emotion. I let it go, but a knot of unease formed in my stomach. The longer I lived with Clara, the more unsettled I became. She never left the room for social events, never made calls, and never seemed to relax. Even when she wasn't studying, she'd sit at her desk, staring at her planner as if it held the secrets of the universe. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to get some water. As I passed her desk, I froze. Clara was sitting there in the dark, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her desk lamp. Her history book was open, but she wasn't looking at it. Her head was tilted slightly, her eyes unfocused, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. "Clara?" I whispered. She didn't respond. I called her name again, louder this time. She blinked and turned to look at me, her expression perfectly calm. "Can't sleep?" she asked, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Yeah, I stammered. She smiled faintly and turned back to her book. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her, before retreating to my bed. The next morning, I checked her schedule. I didn't mean to snoop, but it was hard not to when it was pinned to the corkboard, right there for anyone to see. I expected it to be the same as always, blocks of time for classes, studying, meals, and sleep. But there was one section that caught my eye. Every night from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m., she had written. Listening, I stared at the word, a chill running down my spine. Listening to what? That night, I pretended to go to sleep at my usual time. I waited, heart racing, until I heard Clara's steady breathing slow. At exactly midnight, she got up. I peeked out from under my blanket, watching as she moved to her desk. She opened her history book, flipped to a random page, and sat there motionless. For the next 3 hours, she didn't move. I couldn't sleep after that. Things escalated the following week. One evening, I came back to the room to find Clara standing in front of my desk, holding one of my notebooks. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned slowly, her face calm. "I needed to check something." "Check what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she set the notebook down and returned to her desk. I wanted to press her, but something in her demeanor stopped me. The breaking point came during midterms. I came back from class to find our room in chaos. My side of the room had been torn apart, drawers emptied, books scattered, my bedding ripped off the mattress. Clara was sitting at her desk, staring at her planner as if nothing had happened. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, gesturing to the mess. She didn't even flinch. I needed to make sure. Make sure of what? She finally looked at me, her expression unreadable. "That you weren't interfering." "Interfering with what?" I shouted. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood, walked to her bed, and lay down, her back to me. I reported her to the RA the next day, but nothing came of it. Clara denied everything, claiming I was stressed and misinterpreted her actions. That night, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend. When I returned to the room the next morning, Clara was gone. Her desk was empty, her bed stripped, and her schedule torn into tiny pieces on the floor. I never saw her again. A week later, I got a text from an unknown number. "You should have listened too.